If you enjoy this video, consider supporting us on Patreon for just $5 a month. Click on the card in the upper right hand corner for more information. Hey guys, this is Julian of Julian Gray Media. Today's video is based on a request I got a few weeks ago to make a video on how to warp vocals into time in Ableton Live. This is a request I get a lot from more Novice producers, and it's not as hard as you think it is. So one of the biggest reasons why many people consider Ableton to be one of the best DAWs or digital audio workstations is because of how it treats audio and its audio warp system. There's been some attempts to replicate it, but Ableton does do audio warp the best. And that's one of the biggest reasons why I prefer Ableton to other things as well, because of how flexible the audio system is. So without any further ado, we're going to jump into the studio, and instead of just covering vocals, we're going to take a look at some other types of audio clips just so you guys can get a more general rundown of how warping works in Ableton. So without any further ado, let's jump into the studio and get started. Awesome guys, so as you can see, we are in Ableton Live and we are in the arrangement mode here. If you want to know how to toggle, it's right here. You can toggle between the session mode and arrangement. This is more like a timeline, so we're going to stick to this for this video. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to clear out these MIDI channels that's in the default, and then we're going to have a single audio channel just to make this really easy and simple to understand. I'm going to expand this out a little. And what we're going to do is drag in an audio clip. Now I'm going to start off with something like a top loop just so we can get an idea of the basics of a warp function or something like it. So let's drag this in. And let's take a look here. We have these little markers above our audio clip. These only appear if you turn warp on, but by default, warp is going to be on. And this is what's going to enable us to be able to mess with the timings of our vocals. So essentially what warping does is exactly that. Let's say you have a piece of plastic and you bend it. These 2 points are now going to be slightly closer than these 2 points. And what do you call that? When you bend plastic, you're warping the plastic. You're adding I guess different, you're kind of stretching and compressing that plastic or whatever material, and that's what warping is. So we can do that in audio here. If we turn this off, this is what the audio clip would look like in something like iTunes or Audacity. We just drag it in and you play it at real time. The magic of Ableton is this warp function here, and this is what you see when you enable that warp function. As you can see, it automatically draws these pseudo warp markers above each and every transient. A transient is just one of these like clips of audio. It's like a short, almost a one shot of audio. It's a very short bit of audio that basically fades over time like this. So that's what we call a transient, and it draws these pseudo warp markers above those transients here. And as you can see, if we drag them, we can actually move these around in the grid. Right, so this is very flexible, and this is something you can't do in something like Logic, for example. It's not natively featured like this. This gives us a lot of flexibility, especially with things like vocals that we want to get into time, because we can drag these points and get them precisely on the grid. And that's really the magic of Ableton's warp mode, or warp function. In addition to the warp function, you have warp modes. These are the warp modes. If you want a full rundown on all of the warp modes, my buddy Slink, we've done some collaborations in the past, did a wonderful video explaining all of the warp modes in depth, and you can check out that video in the upper right hand corner right now. I definitely suggest looking at that before diving super deep into warping. So we've gone over the pseudo warp markers, which are the points above the transients that Ableton automatically generates. And this is pretty obvious how this works. It senses when there's an obvious transient like this or this, and then it pastes basically a warp marker above those transients. If you double click above the pseudo warp markers, it creates a real warp marker, which is this right here, as you can see. And these are more generally used. You hardly ever use the pseudo ones like this, because then it's a little bit harder to tell what you're warping. I like to use the real warp markers just so you can really see exactly where the points go. So let's go ahead and try some actual warping here. We're going to give this clip a listen. And if you can see, let's go into quarter notes here. As you can see, these bigger transients are hitting on every quarter note, and if we go to the eighth note, it's going to cover every single transient like that. Now, this is just a standard 4/4 pattern with a kick here. Well, there would be a kick here if the loop had a kick, and then a clap on every 2. If you guys want to learn about basic syncopations and rhythms, make sure to check out my video on that. That's actually very important to understand this. You're going to find it's much easier to warp vocals and things like that once you understand the basics of syncopations, time signatures, and that sort of thing, note values, etc. So go ahead and click on the link in the upper right hand corner right now to check out my rhythm video before you watch this video again. So these right now are warped into an 8th note rhythm with these major transients on every quarter note, which is a standard like house groove, and that's expected. This is basically a house loop. And we can, as you can see, we can drag these points directly onto the beat. If you understand exactly how these sound, or a rhythm like this sounds, and you can diagnose which notes they are, it's very easy to go into that grid mode. Like let's say we put it on quarter note grid here. Now we can't drag these onto where they belong. But if we know that this is an 8th note and we put it on an 8th note grid, then we know that every single note will land on an 8th note like that. And that's very handy. If we wanted to go super digital, we could and actually make all of these points exactly on the beat. So if you highlight everything and then press quantize or command U, then you're going to get these perfectly on grid like that automatically. Again, I don't suggest doing that. So the magic of warp also allows us to do things like make this clip double the length or double the speed, and half the length or half the speed if we wanted to do that. Let's just put these right on the main transients. At least we want to put them right on the quarter notes. And we can hit something called ×2, which makes this double the length, which is effectively half the speed. Or we can hit half speed, or divide by 2, which is double speed. And if your warp markers are in place like this, it's going to do a very good job at dividing that rhythm by 2 and making it fast. This is when you can get these warp modes. Again, check out Slink's video on this, and you can actually pick the warp mode according to what it is you're warping. Beats for this would be the least destructive for rhythms. So now that we've got this all quantized, I can go ahead and start warping some stuff around here, make it a little bit more interesting. So maybe put the clap here instead on the 3 instead of the 2. And you can do cool stuff like this with the warp function. You can also do this with vocals, and we're going to get into that in a minute. By having these nodes that you can stretch and compress, you can actually just do really cool stuff with audio that you can't do in any other DAW. Stuff like that. So that's a drum loop. That's really simple. We're only dealing with quarter and 8th notes, basically. Let's go ahead and try out a vocal now. And we'll go ahead and drag in a vocal like this. So you're going to notice this is going to be way off the grid.
But this is a fight I cannot lose.
I'm going to see if I can find the dry version of this instead. So let's go ahead and try this dry one out. I don't like the vocal effects on there. If at all possible, always try to use a dry vocal that you can apply effects to later instead of using a wet vocal, because then you can't remove things. So we're going to go ahead and run with this one here. And as you can hear, when I play this in time with the metronome, it's going to sound way off.
But this is a fight I cannot lose.
So in general, this is where a lot of producers, or beginner producers I should say, run into problems. They get a vocal that doesn't really work with the tempo of the song, and then they try to start going in here and dragging point by point to get the vocal exactly in time with the beat. This is actually a really kind of silly technique, because I think that you can get a better result if you just set the tempo of whatever you're working on to the tempo of your vocal and then warp it. So if you're going to run into a few things here. If you're working with a remix pack vocal or a pack vocal or something like that, they're almost always going to be rhythmically in time. The vocalist probably sang it in time, and then they probably did some warping on it. As you can see in this vocal pack, this one that we're using right now is 132 BPM. Generally, vocals are going to give you a BPM. If it's a remix competition, they'll give you the BPM of the original song, or you can easily look it up on something like Beatport, or I think there's a site called like bpm.com or something. And yeah, you can actually use that to your advantage here. Instead of going in here willy-nilly and trying to adjust point by point to try to get this in time, which you can do, but it sounds very fake and digital. What we're going to do is a little bit of a hack here. If we set the tempo of the song to the tempo of the vocal here, it's very easy to set our vocal warp points up. So let's do 132. This is a technique I use all the time. Let's drag this in. And then as you can see, if we play with the metronome, it's going to sound at least more in time than before. Let's turn off warp here. And then turn it back on.
But this is a fight I cannot lose. So what are you waiting for?
So you can already hear that this is much closer to the tempo than the original version we did at 88 BPM or whatever. So my suggestion to you is, if you're writing an instrumental and you just want to toss a vocal on it, try to find the vocal's tempo, and then you're going to set the tempo of your song temporarily to that tempo of the vocal used, and then warp the vocal into time of the tempo it was originally written at, or what have you. If you're working with a vocalist, have them record against a metronome to try to keep it in rhythm. You don't want to get a vocal that's off time and have to warp it. You never want to do that. It's the whole can't polish a turd thing. You want, if at all possible, to get the vocal recorded in time. And more times than not, if you download a vocal like this, it's a pack vocal, it's going to be in time. It's just a matter of lining it up. So, okay, let's keep listening to this and see if we can get this a little bit closer. As you heard, because we set the tempo of our song to 132, exactly where the vocal was set in the pack, it's sounding much closer than when we had it at 88, obviously.
I feel a little competition.
So what I like to do is to mute the vocal and let me just memorize a few of the words, and then I'll sing it against the metronome to kind of put it into my mind where the vocal should be. Let's say, I feel a little conversation, or whatever it was, and let's see if we can line that up in the way that I just did it in my mind. So let's see. Start that right on this quarter here, and then maybe we'll drag that onto the beat right there. Maybe we'll drag this to that quarter note, and also keep in mind, the rhythms that we covered in the other video. You want to try to align these with the syncopation of your track. So let's say that most of your track is working off of eighth notes. You don't necessarily want to warp this onto like a 32nd note. This is weird. Like, you'll hardly ever run into music where it lines right there. You're going to want to do it like here. So let's change this back to eighth notes. And then maybe we'll drag this over. Feel a little competition. Maybe it's there. No, it's a little bit too early. And again, it's just finessing where you want to put these. But basically, if your vocal was set to, the tempo of whatever it is, you can actually apply the same tempo in your host DAW, and then you can warp to that. And then again, you can always put them right on where they should be. The main syncopation of this is 16th notes that I've noticed here. As you can see, this lines up with the 16th there, it lines up here, and it also lines up here. So maybe drag this over here, like that. And as you can see, this would be impossible to do if you're at 80 BPM. But because we're at 130, it's very easy to see where these are supposed to be. This is supposed to be here, for example. Or let's see. Let's give this a listen.
So what are you waiting?
Maybe put this here.
So what are you waiting?
Let's see. Sometimes it makes false markers too, so take that into account.
What are you waiting for?
Put this here.
Waiting for? Meet me on the dance floor.
Really cheesy vocal, but bear with me here.
Meet me on the dance floor.
And again, just warping these into the basic syncopation of the vocal here at 16th notes.
Dance floor.
You just want to do that. And when you're in time like this, when you're in the tempo of the vocal, it's very easy to see where they should be. So I really hate this vocal. I'm going to put this in Complex Pro. Again, watch Slink's video on it. And maybe we'll just use some of this. We don't necessarily have to use the whole thing, but
Feel a little competition. But this is a fight I cannot lose. So what are you waiting for? Meet me on the dance floor.
and that's pretty close. So let's go ahead and delete this end section here. I hate it. The vocals are super cheesy. I can't take it. And as you can see, let's just put it to like the closest 8 bars or whatever. Let's do like a 1 bar here. Yeah. So we're 2 bars off from the start. I always work in bigger increments like this so I can easily drag it and it'll always be in time. And then we can go ahead and set our tempo back to whatever it was, 88 for example. And now this vocal will work.
Feel a little competition. But this is a fight I cannot lose.
And as you can see, because we warped it at the tempo of the original vocal, it's very easy to get the warp points right on the money. And then whenever you stretch it, Ableton's going to take those points into account, and it's going to know exactly how to move that warped vocal into whatever tempo you set it at. So now we can do like 170, and it'll still work.
Feel a little competition. But this is a fight I cannot lose.
So the real key and the kind of end-all be-all of getting your vocals in time is to get these warp markers set at the tempo that the vocals were recorded in. And if the vocals were recorded off tempo, it's better to just re-record them or have the singer play against a click track like a metronome while they're recording so they can get it right on time. Because it's very, very difficult if I'm in 100 BPM and the vocal was written at 130 to move all of those points over to compress it into whatever tempo that you need to change it to. So let's just take a look one more time at these steps. We're going to drag in the vocal. We're going to set the tempo to whatever tempo that the vocal is. If it's a remix, we can find that on Google or bpm.com or Beatport or whatever. Set the tempo of our song to that, regardless of if we've written the song or not. And vocals are actually one of the first things I do so that I know what I'm working with. You're going to want to do that. You're going to want to drag the vocal in onto the timeline after you've set this to whatever it is the tempo of your vocal is. Then you can easily see exactly where the point should go. And we address that here. You can see the syncopations, like this is obviously should be here. And it gets very, very close. You can see like that should be there or this should be there. And again, you can fine tune all of this, but the bottom line is setting your tempo to the speed of your vocals makes it very easy to warp. And then once you have these warp markers in place, you can actually just change the tempo to whatever you want. This could be 200 for all I care.
Feel a little competition. But this is a fight I cannot lose.
And again, you can always go in and adjust these manually, but do a little bit more work, but that kind of illustrates the general idea. The other thing is to sing it in your head to try to get an idea of how the vocal should go. Maybe mute the vocal out, sing it in your head, and imagine it. And once you get an idea of how it goes, then it's easier to drag the points and be like, this is how I want the syncopation to be instead of how it is currently. I've done that several times where I completely revamped the vocal. I reused it in a completely different way just by moving some points around and stretching certain bits. And yeah, that's the basics of vocal warping. Not much else to it. Again, watch Link's video on the different warp modes. There's different applications for each of these to reduce the damage that you do and artifacts that you get when warping different types of clips. For vocals, I suggest Complex Pro. It's the least destructive. And that's generally all there is to it for vocal warping. We covered loop warping, very, very easy. And not much else to it. Another thing I forgot to note is you can add a clip or a warp marker wherever you want in the clip. If you wanted to stretch out a note, let's say, to a really long percent like that. That's how you can get some cool stuff like noisier sounds and stuff like that just by stretching audio out. And that's a really powerful sound design tool as well, because you get these really cool grains and stuff. But alas, it's irrelevant to this video. That's how you warp vocals in Ableton Live. The easiest way I've found, at least, to do so. Never warp your vocals in a tempo that your vocals aren't written in. That's a really bad idea. And that's pretty much it for this tutorial. If you enjoyed it, give it a like. If you didn't, give it a dislike. Let me know why in the comments below. Give me future suggestions for videos down there as well, and in our Discord and Facebook groups. Those links will be in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. I make 3 videos a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And I am Julian of Julian Gray Media. I will talk to you in the next one. Bye-bye.